Hello and welcome to PC Retro Tech. Well, it's September and you know what that means. It's Tandy. So I have something really quite special for you guys, which I've been holding since the beginning of the year when I purchased this machine. It's a Tandy 1000. These are a bit of a novelty here in Europe where I'm located. In fact, they're so vanishingly rare that I had to have this one sent over from the US, a journey which it very nearly didn't survive. And if you're new to the channel, you might not know that I don't just cover old PC hardware, but I also try to program PC clones and compatibles. If that sounds like something you might be interested in, it might be a good time to subscribe to the channel, at least for the month of September, and who knows, maybe you'll stick around. So I'm going to make a number of features on this machine this month. We're going to clean this up and get it working properly and play some games on it. Then we'll check out the hardware. But then I'm going to try and program the very unique sound and graphics system that this thing has, something I've been looking forward to all year. Well, before I start doing anything at all with this machine, I have to make it safe. So when I first got this about 9 months ago, I got a kind of shock from the power supply unit, and I think that maybe some of the filter capacitors might be shorted and are actually shorting the live wire to the case here. So this is probably going to need some repair. Of course, we use 240 volts over here instead of 110 they use in the US. So I'm converting everything down with a big old power brick, and at first I had a lot of trouble finding one over here with a 3-pin socket. So at first I couldn't plug anything in. And similarly with the power block, I finally found one with 3-pin sockets. So I can, for example, plug in the monitor, and this cable is actually hardwired into the monitor, so I didn't want to change that. The one for the computer is actually missing its ground pin. It's supposed to be there, it's just been snapped off. And I'm a bit worried about this anyway, because although I in theory have ground going through to my power brick, the cable that's on the brick is only 2 pins, so nothing is going to be grounded with respect to my apartment. So I don't want to take the risk that the power brick company just cheaped out on their safety equipment. I'm going to measure the voltage with respect to my apartment ground, just to make sure everything's safe to work with. Well, if you excuse all the cables, I've got my multimeter set to the AC voltage range, and it's just detecting some stray voltage at the moment. But what I'm going to do is measure from the side pin here, which should be ground in the European socket, and the metalwork of the power supply casing. Now, the switch itself is plastic, so I don't have to worry about touching that, but I'm certainly not going to rest my arm on the metal chassis. In fact, what I might do is just measure it now while it's plugged in but not switched on, and just make sure there's no really ugly surprises. And indeed, is that volts? Oh my goodness, I think I might just step back a little bit. What is going on there? That doesn't make any sense at all. I suppose that explains why I got a shock from it 8 or 9 months ago when I first switched this on, but why? So let me just measure between ground and the rest of the chassis here and just make sure that is all live. Yeah, so that's really bad. In fact, even with the plastic cover on this thing, that metal chassis is exposed on the bottom of the machine. So if you picked up the machine while it was plugged in, even switched off at the power supply, that could be lights out. And I'm not clear whether the earth leakage detector in my apartment would actually switch the breaker in this case or not. Someone might like to comment on that below. But I'm mystified at why this is actually happening. So let me just measure the voltage between the wall ground and my American socket ground and see. Yeah, that's the voltage there, but why is that appearing there? Especially since I have no ground pin in my cable. That makes no sense at all. So I'm going to have to look into this. I may have to pull that power supply apart. It doesn't even seem like it is a capacitor issue. It might actually be something come loose and shorting to the side. So yeah, I will look into this and get back to you. I may need to pull the supply apart, and I can't recommend doing that yourself unless you are an expert. There's capacitors in there that can be charged to high voltage and other dangers. And I suppose I'm not doing a whole load to encourage you to go and buy one of these old machines yourself to enjoy, but this is an unusual case. I really am scratching my head at the moment where the issue is here. I don't think that I'm doing anything non-standard here. So once I figure it out, I'll report back, but yeah, what a deadly surprise. Well, I managed to convince myself that this is safe after all. I did some extensive testing off camera, which I won't go into because I wouldn't want that used as a template. But I managed to show that in this specific case, the amount of current that could go to ground here is negligible. In fact, it's probably hundreds or thousands of times less than could even give you a shock. And when I got this machine, I actually did some work on it. I remember now it had some shipping damage, which I straightened by hand. And I actually took the drive in and out a couple of times to get back to the seller about that. And this is actually connected to the case with a metal clip. So I know that it was plugged in at the time, and therefore there's absolutely no risk just touching the chassis here, especially since I can't really contact ground easily anywhere. I'm really isolated. So what I think happened is I had my thumb on the supply when I switched it on, and a transient generated at startup gave me a small jolt, but certainly nothing to be concerned about. And basically, if the plastic cover is on, even that can't happen. So just to be 100% sure, I am going to take that supply apart and give it a safety check. I mean, it might be fine today, but who knows, it could be a problem tomorrow. So better to be safe than sorry, right? And I disconnected the monitor to make sure that's not part of the puzzle. In fact, the voltages here are still high. I think I get 160 to the wall socket ground, and from ground to ground it's still 100 volts. It's lower than it was before, but it still shows that if there's a fault I will find it in that supply. All of the rest of the circuitry here is low voltage, of course. Now the monitor could also be a concern, but it is completely insulated with plastic, so I'm more worried about this one, which has exposed metalwork. But I'm actually pretty confident that everything's going to work out here, and we should be able to power this up and see it in operation. Well, the supply is finally out, and Tandy has been awarded 0 points for making things easy to access, but with a handful of screwdrivers and a wrench, I did finally get it free. This end of the supply actually comes loose, and so you can get access to this end. And I'll need to take the fan out. Obviously it's covered in dust, and the back cover is pretty much the same. It's not surprising given its age, of course. A quick check around, I don't see anything obviously wrong. There's nothing touching the case. It's very likely to be good news, actually. Well, with a thorough clean and a really good checking over, this thing is right to go. It looks $1 million, and I don't see any problems here. No shorts on filter cups. This is a working supply. So let's get it back together and power it up and see whether the machine actually functions. Well, I've already turned up a couple of interesting things in the card expansion bay here. This is a hard card, which I already mentioned. It's got a Western Digital hard drive on it. So that's going to be really interesting to try out and see if it still functions 100% after all these years. And just behind it here, just fitting, is a couple of COM ports with an SIS chipset. Nothing particularly unusual there. And of course there's an obligatory modem, which is fun to see after all these years, but not particularly practical nowadays, of course. This other card is much more interesting though. This actually has an 8088-2 on one end, but if I reorient this and turn it around the other way, this actually has a 286 and an empty socket for presumably a math coprocessor. And there's all sorts of configuration switches here. So I wasn't expecting to find 2 CPUs in this machine, so I'm going to have to look this up and figure out what I'm actually missing here. Really interesting so far. Of course, there are chips for graphics and sound on the main board, and the connectors for that come out the back down the bottom, so you can't really see those on camera at the moment. There's also a card edge up the other end of the machine, down the bottom where the main board is. And I'm not really sure what that is for, so that's something to look into. Of course, I have nothing to plug into it, but yeah, really interesting so far. Well, the plot thickens, so I looked up the Tandy 1000SX, and this is supposed to have an 8088-2 at 7.16 megahertz. But this board here is actually plugged into a socket on the main board, which is for the CPU. So what I find, so I don't know whether this is a standard upgrade for people at the time. If you had a Tandy 1000 SX, comment below and let me know, is this a normal thing to see, or was this some kind of specialized aftermarket upgrade that people put in their machines of the era? Really curious so far, that's for sure. Well, clearly time to power it on and see what actually happens. I'll be interested to see what it reports itself as. So let's switch the monitor on here. It's a CGA style monitor, so it does actually work with a CGA monitor. And at the moment it's beeping, it's seeking. It says it has 640k of RAM, which is good because I think they came standard with 384, but that could be upgraded. I can hear the hard drive seeking, which is a good sign. So let's see whether anything boots or whether it just stops. So ROM BIOS version, Phoenix Software Associates, Tandy Corporation. Yeah, unfortunately non-system disk or disk error. So I don't know whether the drive is just not functioning or whether we can get access to that with a floppy disk. So that's what I'm going to try next. I'll put a DOS disk in and see if we can boot. It's very possible that the previous owner actually just wiped the drive for privacy reasons. So let's try and figure that out. Now, unfortunately, the contrast and brightness knobs on this monitor seem to be completely stuck, unless there's something I'm not understanding about their operation. So I hope the picture is okay here. It's not terribly clear either. I've turned the ambient lighting down a little bit to make it a little easier to see. So I do hear the drive trying to seek, which is a good sign. I don't know whether floppy works. Oh yeah, so MS-DOS is booting, which is good news. So if I can get into that, then I can run fdisk and see whether that hard drive actually even exists. And if so, what kind of partition it has. So let's run fdisk. And usually this will just say no fixed disks found, and that's the end of it. Oh, it's working. Okay, so let's take a look at the current information. So it says 21 megabytes, 100%, so that all looks in order. So the question is, why isn't anything happening? Is it set as active? Ooh, very loud beep. Okay, so I think all I need to do is format this drive and then put DOS on it and some programs, and we should be up and running. Well, as you can plainly see, I've got the drive formatted and I'm running ScanDisk. It had shown some allocation units being recovered, but at the end of the format there were no bad sectors, so I don't know whether it's recovered those permanently or whether they're just going to fail in short order. At any rate, I'm really pleased to see the monitor displaying colour. I'd been quite concerned about that. When the system unit turned up, it was in a box that had split open. It had a couple of old printers in it as well, which had smashed. It looked like everything had been rolling around the insides of the luggage hold in the aircraft. So when the monitor turned up, I just feared that it would just be a box of glass shards. But somehow, even though all of the air pockets that it had been packed with had popped, it actually survived the trip. Now, of course, there's a couple of things that look like they need adjustment here. That moire pattern that you're seeing on the screen, at least the vertical one, is not from the camera itself, but from the monitor. So that does look like it needs fixing, and as I said, those knobs on the front are jammed. But other than that, it appears to be in working order, which is a relief. So I'm going to let this run through and then we're going to put some games on, and if you're not sure what to expect here, it's not just your standard 4-color CGA graphics, and the sound also is just not a standard beeper. So there's definitely a treat coming if you haven't seen this before. Well, what's this? 16-color graphics and 3-voice sound. I'm just going to put the microphone next to the machine so you can hear this a little clearer. Pretty cool, huh? So that's the intro to F-15 Strike Eagle 2, and obviously it's using the Tandy 1000 sound and graphics. So this is a CGA compatible machine with an internal speaker, but it basically has the PC Junior sound and graphics capability. Now, the PC Junior itself wasn't a successful machine. It was made by IBM and unfortunately discontinued very quickly, probably mainly due to their silly chiclet keyboard. But Tandy really made something of this, and the Tandy 1000 was quite successful. I think there was something like 800 games made that supported their sound and graphics in one way or another. Anyway, let's play this game and see what it's like. Well, I'm just running the demo mode here so that I can actually talk over the top of it. And it's probably a little slow on this particular system, but the authors of this game had this in mind. So if you press Alt-D, it'll change the detail level, so you can actually speed it up a little bit and go all the way down to the performance for an 8088, which is the lowest that it supports. So as you can see, you can get rid of the detail altogether, and it does pick up a little bit in performance. I'm just going to leave it on the highest level because after all we're here for the graphics, right? The sound unfortunately is just noise in this one. There's no music playing. But anyway, this graphics system is obviously a big improvement on CGA, and I think it's very historically important. After all, IBM invented CGA, EGA and VGA, and in the PC Junior they had this extended graphics system that builds on CGA. So I think it's very historically interesting. And what I'd like to do later in the month is actually try and program this graphics mode. So basically, there's two things I'm interested in. One is how compatible with CGA is it. We have some stuff that's pretty much only going to run on a CGA card all the way through to just standard CGA graphics. And I want to run all of that and see which of it actually runs on this system. And the other thing I'm interested in is just programming this mode. How does it differ from the ordinary CGA mode? And obviously I'm not going to be able to write a game or something like that, but I think it'll be an interesting experiment just to put some simple shapes on the screen, just to explore how this particular graphics system works at a basic level. So anyway, I don't think we're going to see anything much more in terms of graphics for this game. So what I'm going to do is move on to the next one. Well, this is Castlevania, and I'm showing this one obviously because it supports Tandy 1000 sound and graphics, but I'm also showing it because it has very slow scrolling, and this is one of the issues with 16-color graphics. Basically, you have twice as much data to move about as CGA. 4 colors only takes 2 bits per pixel, whereas 16 colors takes 4 bits per pixel. Basically, in 1984, when the Tandy 1000 came out, EGA also came out, and this helped solve that issue by allowing you to update up to 4 bit planes at the same time. And so this meant that you could basically have 4 times the performance for certain operations. So I'm going to be very interested later in the month to really play around with this graphics mode and see exactly how it's implemented, whether it's just using 4 bits per pixel packed into a byte, or whether it is actually using some kind of bit plane technology. So that's going to be a very interesting investigation. Now, this particular machine that I'm playing on here actually was bought in at least 1987 from the date code on the monitor. And by that stage, VGA had actually come out. So this would have been very much a budget machine at the time it was purchased. Now in 1987, of course, people were also buying 386 machines. And so this was really a very, very low-end system. And a lot of games were actually written to support these XT class machines. But obviously in this case it's not optimized at all well, and I wouldn't call this a playable experience. So let's move on to the next game. Now this is Double Dragon, and I'm showing this one because it's much more reasonable for an XT class machine. I remember playing this back in the day on my XT. Now of course the scrolling in this is much better than it was in Castlevania, but as you can see only about half of the pixels on the screen are being updated. So this is one trick to get better performance when you have a slow CPU. You can just have a window in the middle of the screen, and that saves you from having to update the whole screen. So I don't know what's going on with the CPU in this thing, whether it's using the 8088 mode or the 8286 mode on the CPU card that we found. But if you think about it, it is still plugged into an 8088 socket, so it can only have an 8-bit data bus most likely. So this means that it can't really perform like a 286. All of the instruction execution times will be better, but the actual data transfer rates, to and from the CPU and main memory are still going to be slow. That's unless there is actually memory on that card as well, which I don't know for sure. That is a possibility, I guess, but then I don't understand how the rest of the machine would function, so I think that's unlikely. But at any rate, I want to look into that and try and get to the bottom of it and see whether this machine is currently operating as a 286 or whether it's actually just operating as an 8088. And I think I'm in trouble here anyway, so let's move on to that and try and figure that CPU card out. Well, one way to get to the bottom of the performance of the machine currently is to use the old school PC benchmark, better known as Top Bench. So what I'm going to do is run some real-time benchmarking here, and this will actually test things like the speed of the CPU, the speed of memory, and even the speed of graphics. This is telling us that it thinks it has a CGA graphics adapter, Tandy 1000, so it detects that correctly. And it also says Intel 8088. Now, of course, this wouldn't necessarily be reliable. There's no way for it to know that it's not an 8088. After all, it is plugged into an 8088 socket. But it's telling us the CPU speed's 7.16 megahertz, which would actually make sense because this is what the Tandy 1000 had. So I don't know whether that means that the 286 is not enabled. It's certainly an interesting question. Now, I did look up these cards, and there was a card called the Express card available for the Tandy 1000 SX, which allowed you to upgrade to a 286. Now, basically, what it did is cache the main memory, which is a good strategy, of course, to improve the speed to main memory. So a lot of the dip switch settings on that card are probably just to set the amount of memory that is cached or the speed of the coprocessor and so on. So I don't know whether there's a switch there for changing between 8088 and 286. So this is still a bit of a mystery to me. So what I'm going to do is save the changes here and then basically go and compare it with other systems that we know the speed of, which is one of the great things Top Bench does for you, and then we should be able to figure out how fast this is. Well, this is the Tandy SX that's in the database there, and the timings here are very similar to what I've actually got with my machine. So mine would have a mem test speed of 2795, so a little bit slower than this Tandy 1000 SX that's in the database, and 1639, again a little bit slower for mem EA. Opcodes, I've got 1433 on my machine, and video memory 1758. 3D games, not really relevant here, but 1472. So basically the speed that I have pretty closely matches this, and that's in contrast to one with a 286 Express card here, where the memory test and video memory speed are really substantially faster. So basically it looks like we need to figure out how to turn the 286 on, because as far as I can tell, it's currently not active. Now, what I have read is that these cards were a little bit dodgy, and basically you needed a BIOS upgrade to really take advantage of some of the features of this card, and moreover the machine would often hang. So I'm not sure exactly how useful these cards were and whether people switched back to the 8088 pretty quickly after installing them because they realized they weren't all that. So anyway, let's take the card out again and see if we can figure out how to switch on the 286 so we can give it a go and see how much better it is. I managed to find the card online. It's called a 286 Express card. It was manufactured by PC Technologies, and according to the documentation it's supposed to be in the middle slot, J13, so I've actually moved that now. I had to take the modem out of the machine because there just isn't physically room for all of the cards, and that hard drive is now sitting on top of a chip. It barely makes contact in the ISA slot. So I don't know how critical this is to have it in the middle slot, but we may as well do what the manual says. And also needed is a driver in config.sys to make it actually work. And this allows you to switch then between the 8088 and 8286. So I've actually managed to track that down thanks to Trickster's archive. He has an FTP site where this was available, and actually he wrote Top Bench as well, so thanks to Trickster for all that stuff. So basically what I've done now is install the driver in config.sys, and so let's run Top Bench again and see if we can see the performance difference. Well, I'm not really sure why Top Bench is now running in colour. It was black and white previously, as you saw. Maybe that was just because I'd run some game that interfered with some of the graphics settings. I'm still running it off the same disk and in exactly the same way. Anyway, let's run a benchmark with this card set up and see if there's any difference. And oh yeah, that's a big difference. So basically we had 2795 for the mem test before, now it's 1319 microseconds, so way quicker, more than twice the speed there. MEMEA is about the same, we had 1639 before, and the opcodes was 1433, so a little bit of an improvement there, less than I would have thought, but still. And then video memory, well, that's now at 1232, whereas we had 1758 before, so big improvement there. Now of course the actual speed of video memory hasn't changed. What's changed is our ability to access it quickly, so this is a big improvement. So what I should be able to do now is to change the speed of this processor by pressing Alt and a left or right angled bracket. So I'm going to do that and see what happens. I can actually do it in real time apparently. And yeah, there it goes. Oh, but look, the speed is way slower. So it's now an Intel 8088 at 4.77 megahertz, which is a bit bizarre. So I wonder if there's another setting here that I can select. No. No, that's it. There's only the two speeds. So that original speed that we had, the 8088 at 7.16 megahertz, is not there anymore. We just have the slower 8088 at 4.77 or the 286 at 7.16. So, well, let's try this out with one of the games that was running quite slowly and see how much difference it actually makes. Well, here we are back in Castlevania, and as you can see, it is actually scrolling a little quicker than it was before. Still wouldn't really call this a particularly playable experience, but I guess, you know, if you had an 8088 CPU and you could upgrade to a 286 for not very much cost, then this really made sense back in the day. I'm still really curious whether this was a common thing that people did, or whether this was something that was very expensive and only a handful of people did, or whether most people just upgraded to a full 286 machine of a different kind when they came out. So if you have any thoughts on that, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear about your experience with the Tandy 1000 SX and the 286 Express upgrade card. So basically that's it for this week. Obviously we have a lot more that we can do with this machine. I'm going to clean this up and do a few minor repairs to it. And then, as I said, I'm going to try and do some programming on it of the graphics and sound capabilities later in the month. So if you're interested in that, stick around, subscribe, and give a like on the video if you enjoyed this retrospective on the Tandy 1000. And I will be showing some more games in future videos. We're going to have a real focus on this machine for the remainder of September for Tandy. So thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in a later video. Bye!